President Enrique Peña Nieto's reformist makeover of Mexico has wowed markets and foreign investors, if not yet Mexicans. A blizzard of new legislation seeks to bust up oligopolies, shake up education, modernize labour markets, reform taxes, lower the cost of credit, and, for the first time in over 70 years, open the energy sector to foreign investment. For some, the biggest reform of them all and certainly the most controversial. With me to discuss the reforms and Mexico's prospects is Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. Since NAFTA was signed 20 years ago, Mexico's economy has basically gone sideways while the rest of Latin America has boomed. Real wages today are no higher than they were in the mid-90s. Are Mr. Peña Nieto's reforms the answer to Mexico's problems?
I think the answer is that they're necessary but probably not sufficient. They're necessary in the sense that clearly the market economy needs greater dynamism. I think the proposals for greater competition are an important contribution. Labour market reforms could be really quite important contributions as well. I'm not so sure about the energy reform. We can discuss that in a minute. But the overall attempt to make the economy more dynamic through increasing market forces is important. There's a specific aspect of this which is very clear, that Mexico has a very dualistic economy. It has a relatively small but dynamic modern sector whose share of employment hasn't risen at all, but productivity growth is relatively high. The rest of the economy, which employs something like 80% of the people, has been showing actually falling productivity. Now, he's not going to get anything out of all this if he doesn't actually generate much higher productivity growth in the whole economy. And to do that, he has to unify these two parts. And that's quite complicated.
This is a huge task. I mean, it's almost the task of generations, which leads on to my second question. I mean, there's been lots of fanfare about the reforms, but the Mexican economy has been flatlining. The reform story so far is a case of the dog that didn't bark. Is this the Mexican government's fault or some other factor like a delayed US recovery?
Well, I wouldn't expect these reforms, indeed for the very reasons you suggested. We are talking about a generational reform, to have an enormous effect in the short run. In time, I would imagine they will encourage more investment. That will be a boost. And if the US does have the sort of recovery we hope for, that will also produce a boost. But actually the attempt, if that is the core, and I believe it is, to make the whole economy dynamic, that's a long-term process. It involves profound reforms, including governance reforms, really very deep one in the legal system, in the credit system. There's no credit in the economy for everybody except the big companies. So it really is an enormous task, and that is, I think, a reflection or reflects the fact that it's been 3 decades of stagnation.
It's as much as a series of structural reforms and regulations as a mindset. And I'm just wondering, talking about the Mexican mindset, what the oil opening means for that. Highly controversial, 70 years of state-owned management, not thrown out the window, but an opening for foreign investment in there. How do you see that fitting into?
Well, that's clearly, from a political point of view, it's obviously unbelievably dramatic because it ends this idea of it as a national treasure. It will clearly encourage a lot of investment in the sector. It might, but I think it's rather unlikely because these are traded goods, generate an improvement in the cost of energy in Mexico. Electricity is very expensive. That is also a reform. But I think it's symbolic. It could even create problems. If there were, in the longer term, to be a big increase in oil and gas production, that might well drive up the currency's exchange rate and crowd out the rest of the economy. And on the whole, that hasn't worked well for most countries. So I would it's a double-edged sword. And certainly the idea that this alone will transform the performance for the whole economy and the entire people, that's clearly not going to happen.
That would be a problem of success. Perhaps the current government would be delighted to have. One last question. The Mexican state is weak, let's say, and one can imagine a lack of human capital, adequately staffed regulatory agencies, a corruption scandal erupting and derailing the process. The implementation of these reforms, do you see a risk there?
Well, that's clearly the biggest issue of all. I think that Mexico has got to, and has indeed been for now quite a long time, at the stage in which the quality of governance, government, legal institutions, support services are essential for further growth. It's no longer a really poor country. It's in the middle income trap. And getting out of the middle income trap really does demand high quality implementation, high quality services. It doesn't work otherwise. Can they deliver that? I don't know, but that is the core challenge beyond these immediate, obviously very exciting reforms, but without those changes, I don't think it will generate the results they hope for.
Thank you, Martin.